everyone. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are joining us from somewhere other than the East Coast. We're really happy to be with you on the phone today, and we thank you for joining us for this webinar series. My name is Kelly Pack, and I'm the Director of Trail Development at Rails to Trails Conservancy, and I'm joined on today's webinar by Jim Brown. He's our Manager of Trail Development here at RTC and heads up our work in Baltimore. On today's edition of the Trail Nation Summit webinar series, we're going to discuss mapping, analytics, and gap filling through the lens of two RTC Trail Nation projects, the Capital Trails Coalition in the Metro DC region and the Baltimore Greenway Trails Coalition in the city of Baltimore. We plan to provide a 30-minute overview of the concept and will provide 15 minutes after our presentations for questions and discussion for those of you who can stick around. So at any time, if you have a question during the webinar, just feel free to type it in your chat box. A recording of this webinar and other webinars in the Trail Nation Summit webinar series will be made available at railstotrails.org/trailnation/summit.
Hello, everybody. We are very excited that most of you have decided to or are considering joining RTC in Milwaukee, June 5th through 7th at the Trail Nation Summit. The summit is an invitation-only gathering of hand-picked leaders, national experts, public officials, trail and active transportation advocates, and philanthropic, public health, and economic development professionals from 20 trail network building initiatives happening across the country. The goals of the summit are to provide a venue for those working on trail networks to learn, share best practices, and inspire the rapid replication of trail networks nationwide. Quantify and amplify the value and benefits that connected trail networks bring, and discuss how this vital infrastructure creates opportunities for 21st century communities. And to develop a powerful advocacy voice in support of active transportation funding and investment in trails, walking, and biking.
RTC is organizing the Trail Nation Summit because we believe in the transformative power of trails, and we believe that the outcomes trails can deliver will only be fully realized if we connect trails across the entire country. For several years now, we've been working with some of you on the phone to dig in with partners in 8 places nationwide, places that are diverse in their geography, size, and culture, to build model trail network projects that prove what is possible when we improve connectivity for trails, walking, and biking. These Trail Nation projects in San Francisco Bay Area, Southeast Wisconsin, the Industrial Heartland, Philadelphia, Baltimore, DC, Miami, and Southeast Texas are designed to catalyze the development of trail networks nationwide. But we know that 8 projects isn't enough to bring trail networks to fruition everywhere. Through this event, we're now engaging 12 additional places, many of you are on the phone, to join the Trail Nation Collaborative. We are committing to knowledge sharing and collaboration to replicate the best of our work in the spirit of getting trail networks built as quickly as possible. Each of you from Billings, Montana, Colorado Springs, Houston, Lincoln and Omaha, Nebraska, Memphis, New Orleans, Portland, Rochester, Sacramento, San Diego, San Jose, Seattle, and St. Louis is working on a project that exhibits incredible potential, and we're hoping that together we can catalyze the development of trail networks nationwide.
The work in each of the Trail Nation projects is founded on the fundamental premise that a broad-based network of partners is needed to create the political will necessary to build seamless trail networks. RTC's role in each of these projects is unique, depending on the needs of the community. However, our work is generally defined by the following 6-part playbook that we leverage for effective, efficient trail building. Number 1, project vision. Create and promote a common vision for a trail network that connects people's imaginations with their communities, their neighbors, and their environment. 2, coalition building. Manage an inclusive process to create a broad-based network of partners in the public, for-profit, and nonprofit sectors across the defined region to jointly create political will and implement the vision. 3, mapping and analytics. RTC has already created the most comprehensive geospatial database for open trails in the country. We will use this data set to identify gaps in each of the networks through mapping and analyze those gaps first determine how they could realistically become trails. 4, gap filling strategy, and that's what we'll talk about today. Utilizing the networks of partners and the geospatial database mentioned above, RTC conducts a fine-grained assessment of the connectivity and gaps within the current trail system and develops a prioritized list of trail system investments that will increase usage at the lowest possible cost, improve community health and equity, and build support to complete the network. 5, investment strategy. To develop and implement a strategy to accelerate network completion by securing federal, state, and local public funding to fill the gaps in each trail network depending on which streams are accessible. And 6, engagement. Develop and implement a communications and marketing strategy to raise awareness and build political will, as well as the grassroots support needed to advance the trail project and encourage use. For today's webinar, we are going to focus on the mapping and gap filling elements of the Trail Nation playbook. If you have any questions during the presentation, please add them to the chat box and we'll get to them after our presentation. With that, I'll hand it back to Kelly.
All right, so we're going to start off by talking a little bit about how we went through a process to map and analyze a trail network in the Washington, D.C. metro region. And I just wanted to introduce the Capital Trails Coalition and some of the work that it's doing in the area and the genesis of the coalition. So it's really a collaboration of public and private organizations, agencies, and volunteers working here to connect trails across the region. And our vision is to create a world-class network of multi-use trails that are equitably distributed through the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. What does the coalition do? So RTC kind of co-leads the coalition with the Washington Area Bicyclist Association and the National Park Service. Those are kind of our three primary co-founders of the coalition. And then we have, like I said, more than 40 partner organizations and agencies involved. We started getting together in 2015, realizing that DC is really rich with multi-use trails across the counties that border the district. And of course, we have the federal government as a huge landholder in the area, so the Park Service plays a big role and has some of the most iconic trails in their area in the DC region. So working together with all of these partners, we're looking to coordinate among those public and private stakeholders. And one of the first things that we needed to do to then continue on some of our goals of working to identify trail funding and to broaden the base of support to build consensus around these trail projects is to identify and map the network. And we have done that in various forms over the past several decades. I say here that we've come a long way, baby, because mapping typically looks like this, right, in a public meeting, and there's still certainly a really important place for getting the big map out on the table and marking it up, and it's a really fun tactile experience that people can do and kind of use to come together and understand what a regional trail network could look like. But we have so many new tools available to us now, and we were really excited to be able to utilize some of those in our work in DC. So the very beginning, as I said, the trail network just kind of began to naturally emerge and present itself. We've got lots of long-distance trails here in the region, and through a first convening of this burgeoning coalition, this map was produced, which is essentially just a graphic map that a graphic designer took from the various maps that were used in the workshops, put it into a graphic design program, and came up with this really nice vision map. But what we knew that we needed in order to look at strategies for filling in these gaps and understanding what the priorities of the coalition should be and what the priorities of our jurisdiction partners are, and how we can help them push for those, we knew that we needed to kind of take it a step further to get to where we are now, which is a completely integrated GIS collection of data that provides information beyond just lines on a map. So each one of these lines and trails that you see here, whether they are open trails or project trails, also include a set of information that we call attributes or features of that trail that we can use for analysis to help us understand things like the proximity of population to these trails. So we started, now kind of taking a step back, the way that we began this whole data collection process was first to establish a criteria for network inclusion. So we weren't attempting to simply collect all of the geospatial data and information about every single trail within the region. The goal of the coalition is really to identify and help promote this interconnected trail network that is really world-class and is very accessible to all users. So we created this criteria for network inclusion to help guide us through the process. And for our coalition, that means that the trail network that we're helping to kind of emerge is off-road for the most part, 10 to 12 feet wide, meets good planning standards, design standards, designed for non-motorized use. We're looking for a paved system. We also are looking for all of the trails to be directly connected with each other in some way, and that the full system is well suited for both transportation and recreation. And for the projects that we've identified, we wanted to see that there was enough movement or kind of approval within each of those jurisdictions through a planning process that those trails might be built within the next 25 years. We also did a comprehensive plan review of more than 70 planning documents from the 6 jurisdictions that we're working with to understand, especially for the projects that we identified, where those fall within their plans and their priorities. So the data gathering effort began in 2016, and we decided that we were going to do a little bit of a roadshow and go and meet each of the jurisdictions in their own offices, on their own turf. And most of what we wanted to do was to meet with them in person, both with the planners from different agencies that have relevant trail work. So we were talking with planning departments and recreation and parks departments, sometimes departments of public works. So the planners within each of those agencies and their GIS specialists as well. We wanted to talk with them about what their trails data looked like. So we wanted to know what the attribution was of all of that data and see how their attribution reflected through the criteria of our network inclusion. We also wanted to understand and get from them recommendations for maintaining accurate trails data, and wanted to know more about planning or budget documentation that would indicate their priorities, and any other data that we might have wanted to include in a web application. So that might include trail counts or where other bicycle facilities existed. Since we are creating this map primarily for planning purposes, at this moment in time, we're really focused kind of more on that information, the geospatial information, to be accurate and to collect and establish a set of attributes that we could standardize and have for all the trails across every jurisdiction. So as you can imagine, doing this kind of data collection can be really time consuming. For each jurisdiction that we went to, again, we talked with various departments and staff within each of those departments, and we got different forms of data. Sometimes, again, it was the handwritten map, or it was, a link to a Google map that somebody in the Rec and Parks Department had made. Other times it was a full set of GIS data that included bicycle and pedestrian facilities, so we had to parse out the trails piece. So this kind of effort takes a lot of time, but what you get at the end of the day is a really complete and geospatially accurate set of data. And then also, again, with that set of attributes that you include, that will allow you the ability to query the data in a systematic way and use it as a really powerful tool for advocacy. So this is just a snapshot of all of the data that we collected, and this isn't what our network looks like, but you can see that the example I gave of getting a set of bicycle, pedestrian, and trail facilities, like in Montgomery County on the north part of the map you see there is really dense. So that's all of their bicycle facilities data. In Prince George's County to the east, they just completed in the past few years a really amazing plan to build out 400 miles of trails in their county within 40 years. So a lot of those lines that you see are planned trails that they'd like to see come online in the next few decades. The process for intaking the data and then spitting it back out into a new trail layer that we could begin to use with our partners looks like this. We got all of the data in whatever form it was. We were culling that data and matching it to the criteria that we had set. So if we were lucky, some of the individual data sets from the counties might include things like, is the facility paved, yes or no, or it would give us a surface type of that facility. So we could then query their data and pull all of the trails that were indicated as paved. So we had to do that as best we could for all the criteria to allow those trails that could be included in the network to emerge. We had to digitize non-spatial data. So the example that you're seeing here is a page out of the National Park Service's paved trails plan for the National Capital Region. And included in that plan are a lot of priority trail projects for the Park Service. But what the plan did not have accompanying it is a GIS data set. So we had to digitize some of the maps that were in the plan into our map and combine everything into a single layer. So as we were going through this process, it was really necessary for members of the coalition and the organizations and agencies that we were working with to understand the purpose of our effort. And like I said before, at this point in time, it's really primarily to be used as a planning and advocacy tool. It's not a map that we are at this point in time going to put up there for wayfinding or as more of a trail use map. So we developed this chart here as we talked with those agency partners and funders and just members of the coalition to help them understand what the map is and what it is not at this point in time. I know you might not be able to read all of the different columns and rows in this chart, but it is a screenshot of the attribute table and data dictionary that we created for our trails layer. And I just wanted to share it as an example, and I'm happy to share this with others. It shows you every attribute that we considered and pulled from some of our jurisdiction partners to create kind of one standardized set of attributes that we can query. So it has everything, from surface type and the type of use to who maintains it and owns it, where did the data come from, and other attributes that are going to help us kind of move forward in our planning efforts. This just shows you a snapshot of the mileage breakdown by county and the total mileage of the network that was identified. And we also included the map, the network map, in one of RTC's magazines, I believe in 2017. But this, again, is kind of then the representation of all of the work that you saw to get the geospatial data together and in a great place to use for planning purposes. And now we're able to show this really amazing vision of a trail network that is nearly 700 miles. So some of the big lessons learned was that our approach to data collection provided an opportunity to coordinate among the various jurisdictions, agencies, and to ensure the accuracy and utility of the data. So those conversations with the jurisdictions and going and meeting them in their offices were really helpful, because it was a time for us to talk with them about how we could improve the trail data, but also for them to talk to each other, because it wouldn't necessarily be an uncommon occurrence that the Department of Public Works GIS person had not really talked with the Rec and Parks GIS person, and they have data that each other could maybe use. So it was a really great time kind of within each of the jurisdictions to get everybody, every planner, and GIS staff that was working on trails in some capacity together in one room. And that sparked a lot of conversations just about, about topics like maintenance and some of the priority plans. We also learned that developing network criteria for inclusion can provide a really great focus for coalition goal setting and gap filling. And that a lot of these newer geospatial platforms provide a very familiar environment and easy to navigate maps for collecting edits and suggestions. So we've created through the Esri platform a series of web apps that we use now with our partners, and one provides us the ability to make edits in the map and collect all of that information and continually update the trails layer. And that's been a really wonderful way to just kind of improve that whole and streamline that process. And, this access to data through the Esri platform, which provides all kinds of federal government data, demographic census, provides really limitless opportunities for network analysis. So I will take questions at the end, but we're going to transition to Jim to talk about gap filling in Baltimore.
Thank you, Kelly. So I will spend the next few minutes talking about some of the strategies that have worked on the Baltimore Greenway Trails Network. And we had the advantage of working in one jurisdiction in a much smaller geographic area. So when this project really began gaining momentum, a lot of the mapping work had been done. That being said, within RTC and our partners, we're going to continue to use the new data that we're getting and the new mapping capabilities that Kelly just went through to make sure that our vision makes sense and that all of the partners are on board. But since we are further along in some of the basic mapping, we've been able to work with our coalition partners and the city of Baltimore to start testing out these different strategies to fill in these gaps and turn what we're calling corridor gaps into trails. The image that you're looking at now is a picture of South Baltimore, and at the bottom of the screen, the ribbon of trail on the bottom through the green is the existing Gwent Falls Trail. And then, as you can see in the distance further north, is downtown and the Inner Harbor. And we'll come back to this image in a minute. But the existing project that we're calling the Baltimore Greenway Trails Network is about 2.5 years old at this point, and what we're envisioning is a 35-mile trail network all within Baltimore City, and we're promoting it as a tool to help public health, transportation access, economic development, recreational opportunities, and equitable community connectivity. And what the map that you're looking at is our vision map right now, and it highlights the existing trails and then 5 of the corridor gaps. And I'll spend a few minutes going through each gap for the rest of the presentation. But what this is about is it's taking the existing trails in Baltimore, where you have the Gwen Falls Trail on the west side of the city, the Jones Falls Trail in the center of the city, and the Herring Run Trail on the east side of the city. So working with our partners, we went through the mapping exercise to start identifying the corridors that exist between those trails to find out if there was a way to create a more inclusive and connected network throughout the city. And what we came up with is the image that you're looking at now, which is the 35-mile proposed loop. Out of that 35 miles, 25 miles exists. So the 5 remaining gaps really only amount to about 10 miles of trail. And starting on the Gwen Falls Trail on the left, if we go clockwise around the map, number 1 is the existing Gwen Falls Trail for 14 miles from West Baltimore down to the Inner Harbor. Number 2 on the northwest side is the Gwen Falls Parkway corridor, and that's a non-existing trail. It's one of the gaps that we've identified, and that is a former Olmsted Brothers designed green parkway connector to connect some of the large parks in the city. Then moving east, you have Druid Hill Park and the Jones Falls Trail before you get to number 4, another Olmsted designed parkway, which is now 33rd Street. Then you have the existing Herring Run Trail, number 5 on the east side. Moving down to number 6 is a utility corridor, overhead utility, that we're working with the utility on developing a trail in that corridor, which takes you down to number 7, which is an unused railroad corridor for about 2.5 miles, connecting residential and industrial neighborhoods to the Inner Harbor waterfront, where you're back to the existing harbor promenade. And then the final gap is in South Baltimore, and that's where the previous image was showing, and that is the Middle Branch Port Covington area, and it's a gap between the existing Gwen Falls Trail and the Jones Falls Trail at the Inner Harbor. And that's a mix of residential, commercial, and former brownfield sites where there is significant development happening along the waterfront there. But the idea is that this 35-mile network connects over 60 neighborhoods throughout the city. It connects residential neighborhoods to the downtown core and major employment centers. It connects all of the universities and most of the hospitals, as well as all of the large parks and existing trails throughout the city. So the strategies that I'll go through today are mapping and plan review, coalition building, which is a very important piece of the gap filling strategy. It's very important to have partners in all of the gaps that you are working to fill in. Making the case, building political capital with decision makers, being innovative with limited funding sources, grassroots outreach and community support, public-private partnerships, and building support through design. And like Kelly mentioned, significant plan review is very important. It helps you identify the gaps and potential sources of revenue, potential sources of engagement to develop a strategy to begin filling in those gaps. But I'd recommend looking at regional plans, but also individual neighborhood plans to see what communities that exist along the gaps might want or not want. And then, of course, seeing what the landscape looks like. These are some of the typologies of the different gaps that I just pointed out. It's a mix of former railroad corridors, old brownfield sites on the waterfront, and then the bottom picture on the right is one of those Olmsted-designed boulevards, which we believe has space for to bring back multimodal connectivity through a trail network. So the big one for us in Baltimore was developing a coalition. And when we were going through the mapping and identifying corridor gaps, we realized that we needed to really have a strong, diverse coalition that was representative of everyone in the city, so that this trail project could be more than just a trail project, but could be viewed as something that every neighborhood could support as it would be a community development project for the entire city. So we began outreach to many of these sectors throughout the city in an effort to build as broad-based of a coalition as we can. And then about 2 years ago, we were awarded a Plan for Health grant from the American Planning Association, specifically to build the capacity of a coalition and then start to identify strategies to fill in gaps in the built environment of this trail network. So it started out small, but this support from our national partners at CDC and the American Planning Association were able to give us the resources to work with our small coalition at the time to turn it into what we're calling now the Baltimore Greenway Trails Coalition, which has over 60 partner organizations throughout the city, ranging from community groups, universities, anchor institutions, city agencies, and the nonprofit sectors throughout town. And as our coalition continued to grow and we began doing mapping, we realized that in order to fill in these gaps, we needed to have compelling stories to make the case. And that was a combination of doing the data analysis and mapping. The image on the left shows you where there's the highest concentration of people that don't own cars is. In Baltimore, it's over 30% of the city, and how the existing trail network intersects the populations of people that do have access to vehicles and how they don't. And then also, when you're talking about a new idea with some neighbors or some decision makers, you have to show that it can happen elsewhere. And so showing precedent images of what a former gap in Atlanta looked like and is now filled looks like the Atlanta Beltline. And there's a lot of similar landscape typologies to Baltimore that help people understand that there are strategies that other cities have done, and you can do this in your community too. And then a big one that we tried to be careful about not getting too top heavy, but making sure that we're working both with the grassroots and the grass tops, if you will, is making sure that we're on the same page with the decision makers throughout the city. So, and a good way to do that is once you've identified your gaps, can you identify shared goals and cross-sector collaborate, find ways that you can bring different sectors into the picture to see how these gaps that exist in the trail network might also be gaps in other networks that exist throughout the city. And can you work with your local elected officials and community leaders to bring up those gaps that exist in your trail network to help them understand that by incorporating a trail into those gaps, you can also address some of the other issues that the city is trying to address. And through our work in the different corridor gaps around Baltimore, we understood both through city leadership and at the residential level, there were common themes that were popping up around equity, increased mobility, improved public health, blight reduction, and attracting new investment to the city. And when we realized that we had those goals in common, it made it much easier for our trail project to become incorporated into official city documents, and then all of the resources that might entail. By one example is the Green Network Plan, a recently launched broad in scope green infrastructure plan for the city of Baltimore that encompasses transportation, stormwater treatment, blight reduction, housing affordability, and so on. But through our networking and coalition building efforts, they've identified all of our corridors as pilot projects for this much broader green network plan. So it adds in all of the resources that the public sector has to become engaged in working out solutions to filling in those gaps. And then another one that was relatively new for our work was being innovative with limited funding sources. And in Baltimore, one way we were able to do that was on 3 different gaps. We were able to raise money privately from the philanthropic sector to start doing 30% design packages, which then the city could then use as their in-kind contribution as part of their local match to access final design and construction dollars through federal, state, and local grants to start filling in the gaps in the network that way. And that was something new for Baltimore, and it was something new for Rails to Trails. So we're about midway through that process, and applications will be going in this spring for 2 of the corridor gaps that we identified. And then most importantly, in terms of strategies for filling in gaps is the community outreach. side, and really developing allies and gaining intelligence from the people that live along these gaps, the businesses that exist. And I think a lot of people on the call are probably have a planning background and are familiar with what's happening in these pictures, but a lot of charrettes and open source mapping meetings that helps you gain intelligence, bolster your argument for filling in the gaps, and making each gap strategy to fill it in representative of the needs of that neighborhood. So they start out small, and when things go well, they get big, and each meeting gets bigger. And this is just one example of a pop-up event we did a number of times in one gap in West Baltimore at an existing farmer's market. And we showed up with a large-scale map like this at the market, which is also on an existing trail but adjacent to a gap in the network. And we were able to engage with residents about what they view as healthy neighborhoods, why they walk and bike, why they don't walk and bike. And we're doing all this at the intersection of an existing trail and the beginning of a corridor gap. And all of these people live in the corridor gap. So we're gaining very good intel, if you will, and we're documenting it to show decision makers that there is an impetus from residents and stakeholders to fill in these gaps. There's some more. And we worked with a local photographer, so now we have this on record and can show it to decision makers and community leaders. And then out of that became some pop-up events. This one is a temporary crosswalk installation, again in a corridor gap, which draws attention to the inequities of what exists for the active transportation network in that part of the city in accessing the park. And it shows the city council members and the Department of Transportation that there is in fact community need to start addressing this difficult road crossing, but it's also a crossing that will exist in our completed trail network. And that's what it looked like on a sunny day. Mm-hmm. And so this was a temporary project, and after the rain after a few weeks would wash these footprints away. The signs are still there, but when the city council person saw it, he said, why didn't we do this permanently? So proof of strategy. And then I'm almost done, but I wanted to show another more traditional strategy on another corridor is, again, showing up, hearing from residents, gathering intel about what this corridor means for the neighborhood and how it can fit into broader goals that the neighborhood has, but that the larger community has too. And they can start out small and get very big if the idea is liked enough or controversial enough or endorsed enough. We went from having meetings with a few dozen people to the meeting in this image has over 200 folks. And a consensus came out of it that there's a definite need for finding out the best way to fill in this gap and developing a strategy for finding that on 33rd Street. From a communications perspective, too, when you get meetings this size, the media starts to get attention. And that could be another strategy for trail builders, is to use that platform to tell a good story and tell a compelling vision about the value of trails in your community. And then I'm going to close out with public and private partnerships. Each location is different, but there are private entities and public entities all over the country. And in this instance here, the waterfront that you're looking at is the site of a huge redevelopment package. It's actually where Under Armour is planning to build their world headquarters, and a massive mixed-use development on both sides of the water there. It also represents an area in the city. The area closest to us in the foreground is severely disconnected from the area in the distance where most of the jobs are. So this development has the opportunity to start being a connection and taking down some of the barriers in the built environment and making them more of a connective fabric throughout the city. So we're working with the developers, the neighborhoods, and the nonprofit organizations to make sure that the development that does happen includes neighborhood connectivity and, most importantly, trail access to both the water and the park system, but active transportation access to transit and to the city and downtown, which is about a mile away. And that's been going well. We have a good relationship with the developer, and with all city partners on that side. And then one more example of the public-private partnership is the utility corridor that I mentioned. This is an example of us doing one of our site visits with the utility. And at first, a large utility might say, no access to our property. But as the vision started growing around the city, everyone from leadership on down within the utility companies started to endorse the idea. And now they're working with us and our coalition to figure out a design solution to use that corridor gap as part of the connective fabric of the city in East Baltimore. And as I close out, I also want to mention that, and this can be difficult because you have to find the resources to do it, but they're out there. Using design strategies to come up with images that help tell your story. So when you're talking about filling in a particular gap, you have the tools necessary that help people understand what you're actually talking about. And a really valuable way to do this is before you come up with these drawings and these concepts is to absolutely take the information you glean from the charrettes to make sure that it's responsive of what the community is looking for. And one of these images was done with the money that we raised to hire a consultant to do the preliminary design for the city. And one was pro bono from a design firm in the city that really wants to be part of this project. And the other two are from students. So that's an option too, working with architecture, landscape architecture, or nonprofit design shops around your community to come up with these images that can help tell the story. So in closing, just want to reiterate some of the points that we've learned is that this work definitely takes time, but in order to be successful, you have to go at the right pace that allows you to talk to everyone and invite everyone to the table so that you hear everyone's perspective about what you're calling a gap. Other people might not view it as a gap, but so you can hear from everyone to figure out the best strategy to start moving the ball forward. And then really importantly is identifying common goals so that you can have this collaborative effort. And then understanding the history of the place. A lot of this network is built on a 100-year-old Olmsted vision that never really happened. But then the more contemporary history has the fact of discriminatory housing policies in the city. And can you use your visioning and your gap-filling strategies to try to reconcile the good and the bad of the history of a place. And one thing we've learned in the last 2 years is that people will really want to be part of a compelling vision. So constantly keep thinking about how your vision and how the existing parts and how the parts that don't exist yet can make your project something that everyone wants to be a part of. Because once people understand the value that trails can bring, they're going to want to work with you on figuring out ways to fill in those gaps.
Awesome. Okay, so we're almost at time, but we will stay on until we get through these questions. I want to make sure we answer them, and we've got a few good ones queued up. So the first question is from Victoria. What would cause a built or planned trail to not be in your regional network?
So this is Kelly, and I'll respond from the DC experience. Since we were really thoughtful about creating that criteria, pretty much anything that didn't meet that criteria wasn't included because we felt that the criteria reflected trails that would help us establish this world-class network. We did grandfather some very important trails into the network. For example, the C&O Canal towpath here that extends to Cumberland, Maryland, is not paved, but is an important trail connection to other trails that are within the network. So we did have a few exceptions to the criteria that we documented, and we also had a kind of set of documentation of why we accepted those exceptions within it. But yeah, we didn't include trails that kind of were islands in and of themselves, so they didn't have that interconnected interconnective criterion that met there. And we were really, again, looking for paved trails within the area that serve and are accessible by all ages and abilities.
Okay, great. The second question comes from Kim. Kelly, how do you keep up with the changes in the information on the trails, such as trails that may have been proposed, is now under design, and who is responsible to gather or report this information?
Great question. And I'm just going to really quickly go to the application that we put together for collecting edits. And let me get to it really quickly here. So you'll see here our network, and we're in the process of revisiting each of the jurisdictions to look for updates and just to make sure that the information is accurate. So we're using Esri products to create these editable applications that RTC staff or members of the coalition can easily use to capture changes. So we might do that by going in and adding a new trail or having comments. Let me pull up here some comments and stuff you can see. So each of these trails, new additions in this second round that we're doing, we've collected notes about what needs to be added and why. We're doing quarterly data reconciliations, basically, so to incorporate any new data that we get, to strip out any data that's bad. And RTC plans to do that for the coalition over the coming year. We also are working closely with our metropolitan planning organization here. We're going to hand over the trail layer to them at some point in the near future so that they can host that on their website. And we've seen that in some of the projects across the country that we work with, that the MPO can play a really important role in being the data collector and, doing the quality control and assurance. We're playing that role for now in the coalition, kind of with the hopes that maybe that, evolves later on, and that maybe other agencies or organizations use our kind of guidance to continue to update this. But for right now, it's kind of under the coalition's purview to do this data update on a quarterly basis.
Great. The third question is also from Victoria. When determining if a trail provides equitable community access, does that mean the trail is located within a community or that it's accessible by a low-stress connection shorter than some specified distance?
I think it could be both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just depends on kind of which one of those you're trying to address. I don't know if you want to talk about equitable access a little bit.
Yeah, every location is different, but in Baltimore, when we talk about it, we see that some neighborhoods have really good low-stress access to the park network and also to the trail network. And then access to the trail network leads to more access to other destinations throughout the city. Access to the park network leads to access to healthy, safe places to have places to be physically active and recreate. And what we're seeing is that the neighborhoods that lack that, it could be something as simple as a safe street crossing, or just something, a sidewalk network within a quarter mile of a park or a trail that doesn't allow access to that park entrance or trailhead. And that's what we talk about when we talk about equity in Baltimore. At least we notice that the neighborhoods where that is happening are also the neighborhoods where there's higher levels of people that don't have access to a car and higher levels of public health disparity. So equity can be a few different things, but for the Baltimore project, we're really talking about it in terms of that every neighborhood should have the same level of access to these quality of life indicators. And that could be increased through some of our data and research by either providing new trails through some of these neighborhoods, and that's the more difficult piece, or the simpler piece that would be an easier reach theoretically, is addressing just simple things like road crossings and existing trails and how neighborhoods can access them already or not.
And we in the Capital Trails Coalition, as part of the visioning exercise and developing our vision and mission statement, we also developed a set of values and defined those. And I think, both equity in terms of how all demographics of people are connected to this system in an equitable way, and equity in terms of equitable development in terms of low stress connectivity are both addressed in that set of values that we have, and that's what we're using to help really guide the work that we prioritize, and that's kind of the phase that we're in right now. So using the mapping and those kind of core values that we've set from the first kind of year or so of our existence, and now moving forward to combine those and, working with the communities and the different jurisdictions to understand how we can better advocate for those critical connections that will provide more access, safer access to more people.
Okay, and then our last question is from Laura, and most likely for Jim, but also maybe Kelly can add too. How have you addressed fears by neighbors to new trails?
Great question. It's really interesting because some neighborhoods along the Baltimore Greenway Trails Network will really love the idea the first time they hear about it, and then a neighborhood that might be directly adjacent to them could be extremely skeptical of the idea and be curious about why would you we don't want this, or why are you coming with this new idea. And we are constantly evolving in our strategies for helping people to understand that the trail network is an opportunity to provide more connectivity and more access to resources for residents all over the city. A lot of people's perceptions are that it's designed for cyclists to get through our neighborhood, and it's not designed for us. And so the neighborhoods that we hear that, we just slow down and spend more time listening to the residents to understand what the goals of their neighborhood are, and can a new piece of infrastructure such as a trail be a low-cost way to start attracting those investments to the neighborhood. And ways that, so a few examples are neighborhoods that might have been skeptical about a new trail. When we began talking with residents about how the new infrastructure could lead to traffic calming, they became more interested. Or when they learned that it could reactivate vacant spaces that are now used for illicit behavior, but if designed in a right way, can become a community amenity, almost like a linear park, and maybe not using the word trail so much. Neighbors become more engaged. And then showing examples, just simple pictures of really well-designed trails in urban environments that show that it can be a really nice piece of infrastructure. Then it helps people understand that when you say the word trail, you don't necessarily mean a walking path out in the woods. That's a big one too, is the language that you're using, and helping people understand all the possibilities and I think also the big one is when you enter into a situation with a new neighborhood or a new stakeholder convening, just keep reiterating that this is the very beginning of a process. There's a lot of distrust in some neighborhoods about planning initiatives that have happened without the neighborhood's input or without community input, and we're being really open that this is the start of a process, and not we're coming to you after looking for your input, but this is the start of a process to see how you would want to make this connection between point A and point B happen. And what that looks like will ultimately be up to the community.
Perfect. So I think that's all of our questions today. Big thanks to Kelly and Jim for cramming so much content into a 50-minute webinar, but lots of really good work going on in both of these projects for mapping and for gap filling. Just a reminder, we've got 3 more of these coming up in April and 1 in May, getting us ready for the summit in June. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, April 10th, and it will be focused on investment strategies. So how do you fund and finance your trail network? And during that session, we'll be talking about primarily public funding opportunities, and we'll touch a little bit on private opportunities. So we'll be sharing the recording of this webinar in addition to the other 2 if you've missed those. And if you haven't registered yet for the summit, please use the link here, or obviously you guys hear from me all the time. This is Katie, so I'll be sending follow-up emails as well with recording and registration information. So thanks to everybody who joined today, and have a great Thursday.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.